They had no idea who she was. In the loud, sweating confines of the sand trap, a bar that clung to the edge of Naval Base Coronado like a barnacle, they saw only what their world had trained them to see. They saw a small woman sitting alone in a corner booth, hunched over a book in a way that seemed to shrink her further into the cracked leather and shadows. To the 20 or so Navy SEALs and their Marine brethren holding court in the center of the room, she was a non-entity, a piece of background scenery as inconsequential as a flickering beer sign or a sticky patch on the floor. They were loud, forged in the crucible of conflict and honed by a culture that equated volume with value. Their laughter was a series of controlled detonations, their arguments were tactical debates, and their very presence reshaped the bar's atmosphere into a pocket of raw, masculine energy. At the heart of this storm sat Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a man built like a seawall, whose voice was a low-grade geological event, and as his gaze swept across his domain, it snagged on the quiet anomaly in the corner. He watched her for a moment, this island of stillness in his ocean of noise, and a thought, simple and predatory, formed in the primitive core of his brain. They had no idea they were about to witness the demolition of a man and the revelation of a ghost. The sand trap was a place that breathed in salt and exhaled regret. The air, thick and humid with the Southern California coastal haze, carried the mingled scents of stale beer, fried food, and the faint metallic tang of desperation. The wooden floor was a permanent mosaic of scuff marks and dark, mysterious stains, each one a silent testament to a night of celebration or confrontation. Fluorescent lights, weary and yellowed, hummed a constant monotonous drone, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the lazy rotation of ceiling fans. It was a kingdom of transience, a purgatory for warriors between deployments, where the currency was not money, but stories, each one louder, bolder, and more embellished than the last. It was a place where reputation was everything, and reputation was built on a foundation of visible, undeniable strength. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne was the undisputed king of this kingdom. He was a monument carved from granite and indignation, with a barrel chest that strained the fabric of his polo shirt and arms thick as mooring ropes. His face was a roadmap of brawls and bad decisions, dominated by a jaw that seemed perpetually clenched, ready to issue a command or bite through steel. He held court not from a throne, but from the central table, a scarred oak monstrosity that served as his stage. His audience, a collection of younger Marines and a few off-duty SEALs, orbited him like moons around a hostile planet. They were his chorus, his echo, their laughter punctuating his pronouncements, their nods validating his worldview. Thorne's philosophy was brutally simple, a binary code of existence written in sweat and blood. The world, as he saw it, was divided into hammers and nails, predators and prey, the loud and the dead. Strength was a physical broadcast, a signal transmitted through decibels and dominance. A man's worth could be measured by the space he occupied, the silence he commanded when he spoke, the fear he instilled with a glance. He had built his entire identity, his very sense of self, upon this crude architecture. It was an edifice constructed of bravado and bluster, and from its ramparts he judged all he surveyed. He saw the world not as it was, but as a reflection of his own internal hierarchy. Every interaction was a negotiation for dominance, every person a potential subordinate or a challenge to be crushed. He was the alpha, the apex, and his certainty in this fact was as solid and unyielding as the concrete pilings of the nearby pier. And then there was her. In the far corner, away from the gravitational pull of Thorne's ego, sat the anomaly. Her name was Anya, though no one in the room knew it. She wore a simple worn gray hoodie, the hood pulled down, framing a face that was neither young nor old, but marked by a profound and unsettling stillness. She was not participating in the bar's chaotic symphony. She seemed to exist on a different frequency altogether. She was engaged in a small, meticulous ritual, cleaning a pair of simple wire-rimmed glasses with a microfiber cloth. Her hands moved with an economy of motion that was hypnotic, each wipe precise, deliberate, and unhurried. She was a pocket of deep space in a universe of exploding stars, an island of profound calm in a sea of restless masculine energy. The noise, the laughter, the boasting, it all washed over her, parting around her like water around a stone, leaving her untouched, serene, and utterly self-contained. Thorne noticed her. At first, it was a flicker of annoyance, a dissonant note in his perfectly orchestrated performance of power. Her silence was not the respectful silence of an audience, nor the timid silence of the intimidated. It was the silence of indifference. It was a void, an absence of reaction that his mind, so accustomed to the stimulus and response of the pecking order, could not properly compute. He watched her, his brow furrowing. He saw her slight frame, the way she seemed to fold into herself, and his internal calculus produced a simple, flawed result: weakness, timidity, insignificance. But beneath that initial assessment, something else stirred, a prickle of irritation. Her indifference felt like a passive form of disrespect, a silent refutation of the very atmosphere he worked so hard to cultivate. In his world, you were either with him or against him. You either laughed at his jokes or you flinched from his glare. You did not, under any circumstances, simply ignore him. She was an error in the code, a variable he could not account for, and therefore she had to be addressed. She had to be put in her place. She became a target. The decision, once made, solidified into a course of action. Thorne pushed his chair back, the legs scraping across the floor with a sound like tearing cartilage. A ripple of anticipation went through his table. Corporal Davis, a wiry Marine with a perpetual sneer who served as Thorne's most loyal echo, grinned, sensing the beginning of the evening's entertainment. The performance was about to begin. Thorne moved through the bar with the deliberate rolling gait of a predator, his entourage parting before him and reforming in his wake. He was not just walking to a table, he was leading a procession, a public demonstration of his authority. The ambient noise of the bar dipped as heads turned, conversations faltered. A spectacle was brewing, and in a place like the Sand Trap, a spectacle was a welcome distraction. He arrived at her booth and stopped, letting his shadow fall across her book, plunging her into his eclipse. He leaned forward, planting his massive hands on the table, framing her in a cage of his own making. The smell of whiskey and self-satisfaction washed over her. "Lost, little bird," he began, his voice a low rumble designed to intimidate, to patronize. He smiled, a baring of teeth that held no warmth. "This is a grown-up's table. The library is down the street." Corporal Davis snickered on cue, a sharp, unpleasant sound. The other Marines shuffled, their grins a mixture of amusement and nervous energy. They were watching a lion toy with a mouse, and the outcome seemed a foregone conclusion. Thorne's monologue continued, a stream of condescending remarks aimed not just at her, but at the entire room. He was performing for them, reinforcing his status. He mocked her hoodie, her book, her silence. He called her sweetheart, librarian, shadow. Each word was a small verbal shove, intended to provoke a reaction, to force her to acknowledge his power, to see him. Anya did not look up. She continued the methodical circular motion of cleaning her right lens, her focus absolute. The world outside of that small piece of glass and cloth seemed to hold no interest for her. For a long moment, the only sounds were Thorne's grating voice and the faint rhythmic whisper of microfiber on glass. To Thorne, this was incomprehensible. His ego, that carefully constructed edifice of dominance, was built on the expectation of a response. Fear, anger, pleading, any would do. But this utter lack of engagement was like shouting into a vacuum. It offered no purchase, no validation. It was the most profound insult he could imagine. He felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. When he leaned in closer, his face just inches from hers, she finally stopped. She did not raise her head, but her voice, when it came, was clear and flat, devoid of any emotion. It was not a whisper, but it was so quiet that it seemed to cut through his booming tones with the precision of a scalpel. "You are in my light." The statement was so simple, so factual, that it momentarily stunned him. It was not a plea. It was not a challenge. It was a technical observation, delivered with the same dispassionate focus she applied to cleaning her glasses. The sheer audacity of it, the refusal to play his game, to even acknowledge the context of his dominance, sent a jolt of pure rage through him. His carefully managed performance was unraveling. The laughter from his men faltered, replaced by a confused uncertainty. The mouse was not behaving like a mouse. The brittle shell of his ego began to fracture. He needed to reassert control, to force the situation back into a framework he understood. The verbal assault had failed. It was time to escalate. With a roar of frustration, he slammed a meaty fist down on the table. The half-empty beer glasses jumped and clattered. The book slid to the floor. "I am talking to you," he snarled, his face turning a blotchy red. When she still did not look at him, he reached out and his fingers, thick as sausages, closed around her wrist. The contact was a violation, a crossing of a final line. It was a physical claim of ownership, the ultimate expression of his power over what he perceived as a weaker creature. Crack. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp, definitive. It was the sound of the world holding its breath. The challenge had been issued and accepted. The moment his flesh touched hers, the universe of the bar tilted on its axis. The change in Anya was not dramatic. It was terrifyingly subtle. The stillness that had defined her did not break. It condensed. It became something harder, denser, like water freezing into ice. The gentle, methodical focus she had applied to her glasses was now directed inward, a system running a final diagnostic before execution. Her shoulders, which had been curved over her book, settled into a posture of perfect, relaxed alignment. Thorn, blinded by his rage, saw only a tensing he mistook for fear. He squeezed her wrist harder, a triumphant sneer beginning to form on his lips. He was winning. He was in control. What happened next was not a fight. A fight implies a contest, a struggle between two parties. This was a correction. It was a law of physics being ruthlessly applied to a man who had foolishly chosen to ignore it. It unfolded in the space between heartbeats, a sequence of events so fluid and impossibly fast that it defied real-time comprehension. For the onlookers, it was like a single frame had been cut from the film of reality. One moment, Thorn was looming over her, a mountain of smug aggression. The next, the mountain had fallen. Anya did not strike him. She did not throw a punch or a kick. Her movement was a pure expression of biomechanical efficiency. There was a minute shift of her weight, a pivot on the ball of her foot that was almost invisible. Her free hand came up, not in a fist, but with fingers extended, rigid as steel rods. They did not hit his arm. They found it. They pressed into a single, precise point on his radial nerve, a place a handful of people on the planet knew how to locate. Simultaneously, the hand he was holding twisted, not against his strength, but with it, redirecting the force of his own grip back into the fragile architecture of his wrist joint. It was a symphony of leverage and pain. Thorn's body, so accustomed to being the source of force, had no defense against having its own momentum weaponized against it. A bolt of white-hot agony shot from his wrist to his shoulder, and his nervous system simply shut down the connection. His fingers unspasmed, his arm went limp. The pivot she had initiated completed its arc, and Thorn, with all his 250 pounds of muscle and arrogance, was not thrown, but seamlessly relocated. He was guided by an irresistible and utterly painless force, his own forward momentum now a betrayer, pulling him down and away. He landed on his back on the grimy floor with a heavy, breath-stealing thud. The air exploded from his lungs in a shocked grunt. He found himself staring up at the yellowed ceiling tiles, his wrist caught in a lock of impossible strength, a small, hooded figure kneeling on his chest, pinning him as effortlessly as an entomologist pins a beetle to a board. Ping. It was the sound of a single drop of condensation falling from a beer tap into the metal tray below. In the profound, ringing silence that had descended upon the sand trap, it sounded like a gunshot. The world had stopped. The SEALs, men who had seen the unbelievable in the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, were frozen, their faces masks of slack-jawed disbelief. Corporal Davis looked as if he had witnessed a violation of the natural order, as if a rabbit had just swallowed a wolf whole. Thorn's worldview, his entire understanding of strength and power, had not just been challenged. It had been utterly and completely vaporized. He lay on the floor, gasping for air, the pain in his wrist a screaming siren announcing his total humiliation. Anya held the lock for a second longer, ensuring the lesson was received. Then, with the same lack of ceremony with which she had begun, she released him. She stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried. She adjusted her hoodie, reached down to pick up her book from the floor, and gently brushed a speck of dust from its cover. She put her now immaculate glasses on, the simple wire frames settling onto a face that was as calm and unreadable as a placid lake. She looked down at the wreckage of the man on the floor, not with contempt, not with triumph, but with the detached air of an engineer observing a failed piece of equipment. Her voice when she spoke was the same quiet, flat monotone as before. That was the final warning. She then turned, intending to return to her booth, to her book, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. The heavy oak door of the sand trap swung inward with a force that made the glasses behind the bar rattle. The humid night air, a welcome shock of cool reality, rushed into the superheated, silent room. Framed in the doorway were three figures, but it was the one in the center that commanded the absolute, undivided attention of every person present. He was not a large man, but his presence seemed to consume all the oxygen in the building. He wore the crisp, starched uniform of a United States Navy admiral, the 4 silver stars on his collar glinting like chips of ice under the dim lights. Admiral Vance did not walk. He progressed. His movements were calm, deliberate, and backed by the invisible weight of immense authority. The 2 aides flanking him were stone-faced and alert, their eyes scanning the room with professional coldness. If the bar had been silent before, it now entered a state of stillness so profound it felt like a pressure change. Every man in the room, with military training, which was nearly everyone, snapped to a rigid, ramrod-straight posture of attention. Thorn, his face a mottled canvas of pain, shock, and shame, scrambled to his feet, wincing as he cradled his injured wrist and attempted to mimic the posture of respect his body was now screaming against. Admiral Vance's gaze, sharp and analytical as a targeting laser, swept across the tableau of chaos. It took in the stunned faces of the SEALs, the terrified expression on Corporal Davis, and came to rest on the disheveled, humiliated form of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. Vance's voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of command that made shouting unnecessary. It was cold, precise, and carried the effortless authority of a man who had commanded fleets. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, at ease. The words were a dismissal, a judgment delivered before the trial had even begun. Explain yourself. It was not a question, it was a demand for a confession. As Thorne began to stammer, to weave a pathetic, self-serving narrative, Vance's eyes continued their scan of the room. They passed over the patrons, the bartender frozen behind the counter, and then they found her. They found Anya, who stood calmly by her booth, book in hand. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the Admiral's face. Recognition, surprise, and something else, something deeper. Disbelief. He completely ignored Thorne's sputtering excuses, cutting him off with a curt, dismissive wave of his hand. He walked past the disgraced Marine as if he were a piece of furniture and moved directly toward Anya's corner booth. The entire room held its breath, watching the four-star Admiral approach the small, unassuming woman in the gray hoodie. He stopped a respectful distance from her. He did not address her immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his voice now carrying a tone of instructional, icy fury that was directed at Thorne, at his chorus, at every man in the room. "You men," he began, his voice low but resonating with power. "You swagger in here, puffed up with pride in your training, your strength, your brotherhood. You think you know what power looks like. You think you understand the nature of a warrior." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the silence. "You have any idea who you are dealing with? You look at this woman and you see a civilian. You see someone weak, someone to be mocked and intimidated." His gaze returned to Anya, and his tone shifted subtly, losing its hard edge and taking on a note of profound, almost reverential respect. "I look at her, and I see a ghost. I see a living legend. I see Chief Warrant Officer 5 Anya Petrova." A collective, sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the bar. The rank alone was a shock. A CW-5 was a rare and mythical creature, a master of their technical craft with decades of experience. But Vance was not finished. "You might know her by another name," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, drawing them all in. "The one they whispered about in the fire bases in Kandahar. The one the Tier 1 operators in DevGru and Delta Force speak of with a reverence you maggots reserve for rock stars. The name the enemy gave her. They called her the Widowmaker." He let the call sign hang in the air, a name full of dread and lethality. He then proceeded to recite a piece of classified history, a story that had become a myth within the special operations community. 6 years ago, during Operation Mountain Sentinel in the Zagros Range, a 6-man reconnaissance team was compromised, surrounded, with 2 critically wounded. Air support was impossible due to weather. QRF was 6 hours out. Their situation was hopeless. A single asset was sent in, on foot, over 20 kilometers of hostile mountainous terrain in a blizzard. 72 hours later, that asset walked back into friendly territory, alone. She had evaded or neutralized 3 enemy patrols, treated the wounded, and guided all 6 men to a clandestine extraction point, which she herself coordinated. She carried one of them on her back for the last 5 kilometers. He turned his steely gaze directly onto Thorne. That asset was Chief Petrova. She did that after being shot twice. The story was impossible. It was the stuff of medals in movies, not something that could be embodied by the quiet woman standing before them. But the Admiral's words carried the undeniable weight of truth. He then turned his body fully to face Anya. He straightened his immaculate uniform, his posture becoming as rigid and formal as if he were on a parade ground before the president. In the dead silence of a dingy bar, surrounded by humbled warriors and shattered egos, the 4-star Admiral, one of the most powerful men in the United States military, brought his heels together with a sharp click. He raised his hand in the crispest, most profound salute of his long and storied career. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded like awe, "it is an honor to see you again." The salute was a final devastating blow to Thorne's world. It was the ultimate gesture of respect, a formal acknowledgement of a hierarchy that transcended rank, a hierarchy based on a level of competence so profound it bordered on the supernatural. Admiral Vance held the salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He then turned his attention back to the wreckage of Marcus Thorne. His face was once again a mask of cold command. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said, the title now sounding like an accusation. "The Master-at-Arms will have a full report on his desk by 0600. I suggest you be waiting outside his office. Your career of terrorizing civilians and subordinates in my Navy's establishments is over." Thorne didn't respond. He couldn't. He simply deflated, the last of his bluster and arrogance draining out of him, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out shell of a man consumed by a shame so vast it was suffocating. The chorus, Thorne's former acolytes, now looked at Anya with a new and terrifying understanding. The amusement and casual cruelty were gone, replaced by a deep and abiding awe that was mingled with fear. They were young men who had been taught that strength was a shout, and they had just learned that true strength was the silence that followed. Their entire conception of the world, of what it meant to be strong, to be a warrior, had been irrevocably rewired in the space of 5 minutes. They looked at their fallen leader not with loyalty, but with a dawning sense of contempt and a vicarious, burning shame. They had been cheering for the storm, ignorant of the tide. Anya, for her part, accepted the admiral's salute with a small, almost imperceptible nod of her head. The story of her past, the recitation of her legend, seemed to have no more effect on her than Thorne's insults had. It was simply data, information that existed, but it did not define the present moment. Her focus was already moving on. She had been interrupted, and now she wished to return to her state of quiet. Demonstrating her complete and utter indifference to the emotional drama swirling around her, she turned not to the admiral, not to the humbled Marines, but to the petrified bartender. Her voice was the same as it had been all night, quiet, flat, professional. "Another club soda, please," she said. "No ice." Then she sat back down in her booth, opened her book, and began to read. Her task complete, the lesson delivered. The story of that night in the sand trap spread through the base like a contagion. It became folklore, a piece of institutional apocrypha passed down from seasoned chiefs to fresh-faced recruits. It was told in hushed tones in the barracks, in the mess halls, and on the decks of warships preparing to deploy. It was a cautionary tale that acquired new, embellished details with each telling, but its core truth remained immutable. It was called "The Night Gunny Thorne Met the Ghost," and it served as a powerful, informal lesson in humility. It taught a generation of young warriors that the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the loudest. It became a parable about the critical difference between a carefully polished image and a core of tempered steel. The legend of the unassuming woman in the gray hoodie became a standard, a reminder that true capability needs no announcement. A year passed. Marcus Thorne was no longer a gunnery sergeant. After a formal reprimand that ended his career, he was honorably and quietly discharged. He was now Mr. Thorne, a civilian living in a small apartment far from the sea. He was seen on occasion at a local community center, volunteering to coach the youth wrestling team. He was a different man. The booming voice was gone, replaced by a quieter, more measured tone. The aggressive swagger had been sanded down into a more deliberate, thoughtful gait. He was often observed taking aside the smallest boy on the team, a quiet, timid child who was frequently overpowered by larger opponents. Thorne would kneel, bringing himself down to the boy's level, and patiently, methodically, demonstrate how to use leverage, how to redirect an opponent's momentum, how to turn a larger foe's strength into a weakness. He was teaching, with a convert's zeal, the very lesson he had been so brutally forced to learn. And Anya? She was gone. The day after the incident, she was no longer on the base. No one knew where she went. There was no forwarding address, no official transfer order in any system that anyone could access. It was as if she had simply evaporated. Some speculated she had finally retired, fading into a quiet, anonymous life she had more than earned. Others, the ones who had seen the look in Admiral Vance's eyes, whispered that she had been reassigned, sent to another dark corner of the world where her unique and terrifying skills were needed. She left nothing behind but a legend and a bar full of men who would never look at a quiet stranger the same way again. She continued her existence not as a person, but as a story, a mythical benchmark of quiet professionalism that would forever remain just out of reach. There is a fundamental misunderstanding in the human heart about the nature of strength. We are drawn to the spectacle, to the grand and noisy display. We mistake the avalanche for the mountain, believing the cataclysm of its descent is a greater power than the silent tectonic stillness of the rock that has endured for millennia. We mistake the crashing wave for the ocean, forgetting the immense silent power of the deep currents that shape continents and drive the weather of the entire world. True strength, the kind that lasts, the kind that matters, does not need to announce itself. It has no ego to feed, no audience to placate. It simply is. It is the quiet competence of the surgeon whose steady hands hold a life in their grasp. It is the patient resolve of the scientist who spends decades in a lab chasing a cure. It is the silent courage of the parent who sits by a sick child's bed through the long watches of the night. The ego, in contrast, is a brittle, hollow thing. It is a carefully constructed edifice built on a foundation of insecurity. It demands constant validation, constant acknowledgement. It screams for attention because, in the silence, it fears it will cease to exist. It mistakes volume for substance, aggression for authority, and dominance for respect. It builds kingdoms of sand and calls them empires, and it is always, always surprised when the tide comes in. The world is full of people who measure their worth by the noise they make, by the shadows they cast. They hold court in boardrooms, in political arenas, and in sweaty bars by naval bases. They demand deference and mistake fear for loyalty. If you believe true respect is earned, not demanded, you understand the flaw in their logic. They build their identities like houses of cards, and they live in mortal terror of a single, gentle breath of truth that might bring it all tumbling down. The lesson of Anya Petrova and Marcus Thorne is not a story about the military. It is a story about the human condition. It is a reminder that we are constantly judging what we do not understand. We look at the quiet, the humble, the unassuming, and we project our own narratives of weakness onto them. We fail to see the depth behind the stillness, the strength forged in fires we cannot imagine. We build our hierarchies based on the most superficial of metrics, how someone dresses, how they speak, how much space they command. And in doing so, we make ourselves vulnerable. We become blind to the true nature of the world around us. We walk willingly into the lion's den because we have mistaken it for a mouse. And then, reality asserts itself. It does so without fanfare, without anger, but with the simple, irrefutable force of a physical law. The correction is often brutal, the humiliation profound. But it is in that moment of demolition, in the wreckage of our own arrogance, that we are given a chance to learn, to rebuild ourselves on a firmer, truer foundation. We are given the chance to finally understand that the most powerful force in the universe is not the one that makes the most noise, but the one that, in its quiet, patient, and unwavering competence, has no need to make any noise at all.